Marlene Cavanaugh buried her husband on a rainy Thursday. 6 months later, she married his son, Kyle, and the town of Redridge would never be the same. What looked like grief turned out to be a cover for something far darker, a secret affair, a slow and silent murder, and a chilling betrayal that would shock everyone who thought they knew them. Redridge was the kind of town where nothing ever happened, until it did, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and sleepy hills. Life there moved slowly. People left their doors unlocked and waved to each other at stop signs. News travelled fast, but it was rarely dramatic. So when Richard Cavanaugh died, in his sleep, the town mourned not just a man, but the sense of safety he had helped represent. Richard had been a fixture in Redridge for over 3 decades. A sturdy man in his early 60s, he owned a small but successful construction business. He was the sort of person who offered free labour to churches and always picked up the tab for coffee when meeting someone younger trying to start out. His sudden death caught everyone off guard. One morning, he simply didn't wake up. His wife, Marlene, was the one who found him. She called emergency services sobbing, her voice shaking as she tried to explain that he wasn't breathing. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest. It seemed straightforward. Richard had been under stress, dealing with work delays and financial strain from a recent job gone wrong. He had complained of fatigue in the weeks leading up to his death, though he brushed it off as nothing serious. With no family history of heart trouble and no sign of foul play, no one pressed for an autopsy. Marlene declined it, citing religious and personal reasons. The town respected her wishes. Marlene handled the funeral arrangements with quiet grace. She wore a black veil and stood by the casket without shedding a tear in public. Her composure was praised by some and questioned by others. Still, grief has many faces, and the town gave her space. She buried Richard within 3 days in a modest service attended by friends, family, and nearly every resident of Redridge. It was overcast that day, with a light drizzle that made the dirt heavy and cold as it dropped into the grave. Marlene stood alone by the headstone long after everyone else had left. In the weeks that followed, she withdrew. The woman who used to volunteer at the library and host garden parties disappeared behind drawn curtains. Grocery deliveries replaced her weekly trips into town. Some assumed she was grieving privately. Others whispered that her silence felt too rehearsed, too distant. But no one had any reason to suspect more than sorrow. Then came the first clue that something wasn't quite right. A florist mentioned Marlene had sent flowers to someone in another part of town every Friday since Richard's death. No one thought much of it, until it was discovered the recipient was Kyle Cavanaugh, Richard's son from a previous marriage. At first, people thought it was just a gesture of shared grief. After all, Kyle had been close to his father, even if he hadn't lived in Redridge for long. But something about the regularity, the secrecy, and Marlene's growing closeness to Kyle would soon raise far more disturbing questions. The announcement came without warning, like a thunderclap on a cloudless day. 6 months after Richard Cavanaugh was laid to rest, Marlene resurfaced in town with news that left even the most open-minded residents speechless. She had remarried, and not just to anyone. Her new husband was Kyle Cavanaugh, Richard's only son. The town of Redridge had always prided itself on small-town values, respect, tradition, loyalty. So when people heard that Marlene had married her late husband's son, the initial reaction wasn't just confusion, it was disbelief. Some thought it had to be a mistake. Surely it was another man with the same last name. But as more details surfaced, the truth became undeniable. The wedding had taken place quietly at a courthouse in a neighboring county. No invitations, no family photos, no guests. Just a legal document, a judge, and a signature that turned a deeply unsettling rumor into reality. At first, people tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was about companionship. Maybe grief had brought them closer. But whispers began to circulate almost immediately. Kyle, at 27, was half Marlene's age. He had moved to Redridge just a year before his father's death, after a strained relationship and years spent apart. Their reunion had been brief and somewhat tense. At least, that's how it had appeared from the outside. No one could have imagined there had been something else brewing behind the scenes. What troubled the town most was the timing. Just months after Richard's death, Marlene had not only moved on, but had done so with someone who shared his blood. It wasn't just unconventional, it felt like betrayal. Friends of the late Richard began to reevaluate everything. Had this relationship started before he died? Was his death truly natural, or had it cleared the way for something else? Marlene and Kyle didn't help their case. Instead of staying quiet or offering explanations, they seemed almost defiant. Kyle moved into Richard's home, the same one his father had built with his own hands, and Marlene updated the mailbox with a new nameplate. Mr. and Mrs. Kavanaugh. It was a cruel irony that didn't go unnoticed. Old friends stopped calling. Marlene's usual circle of acquaintances distanced themselves. She no longer received invites to community events. At the local diner, conversations paused when the couple walked in. People turned their backs, lowered their voices, and stared with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. But Marlene didn't seem to care. She carried herself with the same calm detachment she had shown at Richard's funeral. Kyle, on the other hand, looked nervous, like someone constantly expecting a knock at the door. In a town that remembered everything, their actions left a scar. Behind closed doors, people began to ask the questions no one had dared to voice before. Had Marlene always been this calculating? Had Kyle, barely out of college when he returned, really fallen in love? Or had he been manipulated? And most importantly, had Richard Kavanaugh truly died of natural causes, or had his death simply been a means to an end? The case might have ended with whispered rumours and cold stares if not for Agnes Whitmore. At 78, she had lived across the street from the Kavanaughs for over 40 years. A retired librarian with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory, Agnes had seen enough in her lifetime to recognise when something didn't sit right. For months, she had kept her suspicions to herself, but the announcement of Marlene's marriage to Kyle stirred something in her, a nagging unease that she could no longer ignore. Agnes remembered the night Richard died clearly. She had been up late, as she often was, reading by the front window. Around midnight, she saw Marlene leave the house, slipping quietly into Richard's old pickup truck. The lights were off as she backed down the driveway, her movements deliberate and cautious. At the time, Agnes assumed Marlene was headed to the hospital or a family member's home, maybe in shock. But when she learned Richard had already been declared dead by then, the timeline no longer made sense. Why would a grieving wife sneak out in the middle of the night after calling emergency services? And where had she gone? Unable to shake the memory, Agnes finally made the call to the Redridge Police Department. The detective assigned to the case, a methodical investigator named Laura Simons, was skeptical at first. There was no open case. Richard's death had been ruled natural. But Agnes's account was too precise, too confident to ignore. Simons decided to take a closer look. The first move was subtle. Simons requested Richard's medical records. Surprisingly, there was no indication of heart disease or prior conditions that could have explained a sudden cardiac arrest. Next, she obtained permission to exhume the body. The request was controversial. Many in the town believed the past should stay buried, but the evidence warranted it, and the body was removed under strict legal oversight. The toxicology report changed everything. Tests revealed a significant amount of digitalis in Richard's system, a potent plant-derived chemical used to treat heart conditions. In small doses, it can regulate heartbeat. In high doses, it can stop the heart entirely. It was clear now that Richard hadn't died of natural causes. He had been poisoned. With the ruling officially changed to homicide, investigators turned their attention to Marlene and Kyle. Simon secured a search warrant and combed through the house. She found a laptop tucked away in Marlene's nightstand. On it were dozens of internet searches: how to poison without detection, digitalis in tea, and symptoms of cardiac arrest. The browser history painted a grim picture. Worse still, an online purchase had been made weeks before Richard's death. A vial of concentrated digitalis extract ordered under a fake name. Suddenly, the town's darkest suspicions had proof. Richard Kavanagh had been murdered, and the woman who had buried him now lived under his roof with his son. But as investigators continued to dig, what they uncovered next would prove even more disturbing. A relationship that had started long before the funeral, and a conspiracy far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. Investigators began to piece together a trail of evidence that pointed not just to a murder, but to a calculated plan that had been unfolding long before Richard Kavanagh's death. What had once looked like a tragic loss now revealed itself as the final move in a carefully constructed scheme. Detective Laura Simons and her team combed through digital records, financial documents, and phone data, hoping to map out the truth behind the twisted union of Marlene and Kyle. The first major discovery came from Kyle's bank records. Over the past 2 years, a pattern of unusual wire transfers emerged. Small amounts at first, increasing in value over time. Each transfer had been sent from Kyle's personal account to Marlene's, often disguised with vague labels like consulting or repayment. The total amounted to over $30,000. Investigators quickly realized these weren't simple gifts or loans. They were part of something much darker. Digging deeper, detectives retrieved emails from a cloud backup connected to Kyle's phone. What they found erased any doubt about the nature of his relationship with Marlene. The messages revealed a long-standing affair that began nearly 2 years before Richard died. At first, the emails were cautious, careful not to use names or explicit language. But over time, the messages grew bolder. They discussed meeting in hotels outside of Redridge, plans for a life together, and cryptic mentions of a clean exit that would leave them both free. One message in particular chilled investigators. Sent by Marlene just a month before Richard's death. It read, "I know it's not easy, but once this is done, we can finally breathe. No more secrets. No more pretending." Another read, "It has to look natural. I've studied enough to know how." These messages weren't just damning, they were detailed. One referenced Richard's daily routine, including his habit of drinking chamomile tea before bed. Another listed online resources and articles about natural poisons. Marlene had left a digital blueprint of the crime, assuming no one would ever look close enough to see it. The final blow came from a cloud storage folder titled New Beginnings. It held scanned copies of documents, a new life insurance policy signed by Richard 3 months before his death, naming Marlene as the sole beneficiary. There were photos of the couple's wedding certificate, Marlene and Kyle, filed just 6 months after Richard's burial. But the most disturbing file was a video recorded on Kyle's phone. In it, he filmed himself speaking to Marlene, laughing quietly as he whispered, "We're almost there, just a little more patience." When confronted with the evidence, Kyle broke. Under intense interrogation, he admitted to the affair and confessed to helping Marlene research digitalis, though he claimed he never administered it himself. He said she convinced him they were in love, that Richard was abusive, and that removing him was the only way they could be free. Whether those claims were true or just excuses didn't matter. The conspiracy was undeniable. What started as suspicion had now become a full-blown criminal case. Marlene Kavanaugh had poisoned her husband with the help of his son, plotting in secret while presenting herself as a grieving widow. The betrayal ran deep, but the courtroom would deliver the final judgment. The trial of Marlene and Kyle Kavanaugh gripped Redridge like nothing before. It was more than just a courtroom drama. It was the unraveling of a story so twisted that it blurred the lines between family, betrayal, and calculated murder. For weeks, the local courthouse was packed with reporters, curious residents, and those who had once called Marlene a friend. The woman who had stood silently at her husband's grave now sat in a courtroom, her face blank as the prosecution laid out every cruel detail. Marlene was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. Kyle faced lesser, but still serious charges: conspiracy, accessory to murder, and obstruction of justice. Though both pleaded not guilty, the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution methodically presented emails, text messages, bank transfers, and search history that painted a chilling portrait of premeditated murder. They described how Marlene, driven by money and desire, had manipulated both Richard and Kyle to serve her own ends. Kyle's defense team worked quickly to secure a deal. Under mounting pressure and facing a long sentence, he agreed to testify against Marlene in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony stunned the courtroom. He recounted how the affair began when he returned to Redridge and moved into his father's guest house. Marlene, he claimed, had been the one to initiate contact, first with subtle compliments, then late-night conversations, and eventually seduction. He was young, emotionally fragile, and flattered by the attention. Kyle admitted he knew about the plan to poison Richard, but insisted he never believed Marlene would actually go through with it. He described how she had researched poisons obsessively and convinced him they were doing what was necessary to start over. When Richard died, Kyle claimed he felt panic, but Marlene remained calm, even encouraging him to move in and act normal. They married quietly, he said, because Marlene believed it would make their story harder to challenge. But as suspicion grew, Kyle began to unravel, fearing what they had done would eventually catch up with them. The courtroom sat in silence as the video of Kyle whispering, "We're almost there," played on the screen. There was no mistaking the tone, hopeful, even excited. It was the final nail in the coffin for both of them. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. Marlene was found guilty on all counts. The judge called her actions cold, calculated, and devoid of remorse. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kyle, in exchange for his cooperation, received an 18-year sentence. The court acknowledged his youth and manipulation by an older woman, but emphasized that his choices still held consequences. Redridge was left reeling. The story that had unfolded in their town was something out of a crime novel, only real. A husband, poisoned in his own home. A son, seduced and turned against his father. A woman, driven by greed, who buried one Kavanaugh and tried to replace him with another. In the end, justice was served, but the scars would remain for a long time.